I'm Debbie Travis.
And I'm Tommy Smythe.
And this is Trust Me, I'm a Decorator. So I'm in Tuscany, you're in Toronto, and this is the Mother's Day week.
Yes.
We're being bombarded by stuff, the commercial side of it.
Lots of advertising leading into Mother's Day for sure.
Definitely. So there's so much to talk about at so many different levels with Mother's Day, because I think it's a kind of odd day for some people who opted not to have children, some people who can't have children, but we've all got a mother somewhere.
Yeah.
We've all got a relationship at some point. But there's two kind of Mother's Days, right?
Yes, there are. Well, there's for you, because you're a person who straddles two continents. Well, there's a visual. You have the UK Mother's Day. You get to celebrate in the UK and in North America, which are on two different days.
That's right.
So you get two Mother's Days every year.
Yeah, I won't say I get two bunches of flowers because they often forget, but...
You're a lot to celebrate, though. I mean, you are actually, I should say for our listeners, you are such an exemplary and proud mother, and you are so in love with your kids. And it's reciprocated very, very deeply. And having observed you around your kids, I can see how motherhood has really changed your life. I mean, you would have had this amazing career no matter what, but your kids are your heart. And you definitely wear that on your sleeve.
I think that's everybody, really. But I think one of the interesting things about being a parent is you try and better what you had in a way. So you try and learn the good and the bad and the ugly from your upbringing.
Yeah, or at least build on it, like take the lessons that you might have learned from how you were mothered by your own mother and apply those.
Yeah. And as a teenager, and even I think until you have your own children, you're pretty much adamant that I will not be my mother. And then, of course, the minute everybody who's listening, who's a mother, is listening to this, the minute you are, it's like you sound like that fishwife, screaming and shouting and whatever.
Yeah.
What's the relationship with your mother?
My mom and I have a really close relationship, and she is one of the most extraordinary people I've ever encountered. I mean, she's a person who has been through many ups and downs in her life. She has enjoyed extraordinary privilege and had very difficult times. So she sees the world from all sides, and she sees people from all sides. She's an incredibly, incredibly astute judge of character. And she is very much a no BS kind of communicator in terms of that. If she encounters somebody that she feels is putting her kids in some kind of jeopardy or danger, she makes no bones about expressing that. She's also an incredibly funny person.
Yeah.
But as a parent, she was always incredibly generous. If I had to think of one word to describe my mother, I would say generous, especially when her marriage to my father dissolved. There was never a single time where she disparaged him to us.
That's what I was going to ask you, because I think the hardest thing of a breakup of a marriage is restraining yourself if you're having a Barney with your ex.
And she had incredible wisdom in that.
So she didn't bitch about him or go on. No.
She never did. And she made sure that we understood that, despite his, faults, and certainly he had them. And the backstory on that is that it was a marriage that my mother wouldn't have chosen to have break up, but it was my father's choice. And rather than be a victim in that situation, or rather than try to have her children choose sides in the breakup of that marriage, she actually just proceeded making sure that we understood that both our parents loved us, that our dad was, he loved us so much, and that he was a person with flaws, but he was a human being and he needed to be forgiven. And she was really quite amazing in that.
But your father's not with us anymore, but your mum's still alive, right?
She is, yeah. She's very, very much alive. She's actually in London right now with my stepsister Carrie and her husband Jim, having a grand old time in England.
Yeah, so she's active. She's she's
very active, and she is a really funny, like to all my sisters and I, with her grandchildren. It is absolutely hysterical for us to watch her with her grandkids, because those kids get away with things that we would never have been allowed to get away with. One thing my mother always said about motherhood was that to be a good mother, you have to be loved and feared in equal measure.
Absolutely.
Like any great leader. And that was to me sort of like a very interesting insight into how she parented. You know, we were taught manners, and we were taught to be disciplined kids, and we were taught discipline in life, which is very valuable to have. But we loved her so much that we never felt like she was abusive in any way in the way that she disciplined us. Um, we weren't disciplined or reprimanded in harsh ways. We were taught really well how to be good people, how to be decent people. And I always say to my friends, you know, I found out yesterday that one of my favorite people, one of my dearest friends, is pregnant and she's going to be a mother. And I cried. We were in a cab in New
Oh,
York on the
Tommy.
way to the airport, and we were FaceTiming with them in California. And I burst into tears, and the cab driver started crying as well. He was this huge Middle Eastern man, and he said, "Oh, you are a man with big heart. You are a good friend. I cry."
No.
Everybody was crying. So, you know, like, I mean, the thing about parents, what I always ask of my friends who become pregnant and endeavor to have a family or have kids is just please don't raise assholes that I then have to deal with in life. Raise good people. Just raise people who are good roommates, good partners, you know, good spouses, good workers, you know, good colleagues. Please just don't raise an asshole. That's all I ask.
You know, we do these retreats, women's retreats in Tuscany. And one of the things that I find so heartbreaking is how many women come here who are estranged from their children.
Yes,
To me, that's heartbreaking. You know, their kids have really
it
gone off the
is.
rails. I mean, I'm sure there's two sides to every story, but I think that's your biggest worry. But at the same time, when you're bringing up children, it's a fine line because, like your mum, you're not their friend. You've got to have this sense of fear through discipline,
Mhm.
and at the same time know that you love them.
It's a leadership role. It's really about leadership.
Yeah, and I think it's a very generational thing. And you know, I'm quite fascinated by how each era handled many things, but raising children. And like you say, your mum's funny because she says things, and that's a great. I mean, I had lunch with with Francis on Saturday, Francis
I
Mays.
saw that. She posted about that. Apparently, it was like a 5 hour
Yeah, it
lunch,
was. And you see that truffle? There was a truffle. Honestly, it was bigger than a tennis
the size of a
ball.
tennis ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and she's always full of enthusiasm, but she's doesn't have a lot of filter because she's from
Mm.
that generation who, and of course, when you get to a certain age, who the fuck cares about anything, you know? And she'll say things, you
No.
know, which I love. I absolutely love. And it's so refreshing in today's age. But I think it's the understanding of why our parents did certain things and why their parents did certain things. Like my grandparents were raising their children during the war. And, you know, my mum, you know, would be 20 years after the war finished.
Yeah.
So you're trying to improve, but at the same
Hmm.
time, every generation is coming with different challenges. And today, I think the challenges of everything that's out there socially and it is worse than we've ever had.
Oh, yeah.
But you talk to your mum every day.
Not every day, no. But when we do talk, it's for a really long time. You know, I think one of the most important things to do when you're communicating, especially with a parent that you don't see all the time or talk to all the time,
Yeah.
is to book off enough time.
Yeah.
And so when we do talk on the phone, we talk for a long, long time. And then when she's in Toronto and I'm in Toronto at the same time, which is rare, we get together at her home or we go out for dinner. We make a point of spending time together whenever we can in person. My sisters talk on the phone with her a lot more, but they are all like, well, with the exception of one, two of them are also mothers. So they talk actually a lot about their kids and a lot about my mom's grandkids. So they're more phone relationship and I'm more of an in-person relationship with her. But she, you know, I'll tell you, speaking of the like getting to a point as a mother where you just have zero fucks to give, my mother, one of my favorite stories about my mother is that she and my sister and I, she and Christy and I were in Paris many years ago. And my mother had been in Florida and she'd been in a Chanel store in Palm Beach and she'd seen a handbag that she wanted to buy. And it was a very expensive handbag. So it was a big purchase.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that she was going to just do flippantly. And so she thought, well, I know I've got this upcoming trip to Paris, and wouldn't it be more fun to buy the handbag at Chanel in Paris instead of just in, you know, the United States? So when we got to Paris, we made a plan to walk down Saint Honoré and go to the Chanel store. And at the time, the big flagship was under renovation. So down a little side street, right around Rue d'Anjou, off of Saint Honoré in Paris, was this sort of temporary Chanel store. And it was kind of like a railroad car. It was very long and skinny. And you walked in the front door and you walked past this very long counter. And we noticed when we walked past the counter that there were probably like 5 employees behind this long counter. And there were about 2 customers at the counter. So we went to the back and there was a woman standing there with an iPad in her hand. And my mother approached the woman and she said, "Hello, do you speak English?" And she said, "Yes." And she said, "There's a handbag on the wall over there behind the counter that I would like to see, please." And the woman looked at her and she said, "You will wait in the queue." And she
What?
pointed in the direction of like off to the side. There were like 8 different people waiting in a line. And my mother looked at her and she said, "Oh, I don't think so, dear." And she turned on her heel and she walked right out of the store. And my sister and I were just like, "Well, okay, I guess we
Oh my
follow her."
God. And she's absolutely right. She's absolutely right.
She had zero tolerance for the fact that they were making people wait, even though there were 3 extra employees behind the counter. She was having absolutely none of it. So fast forward a month, and she's back in Florida. And I was on the phone with her, and she said, "Oh, guess what I did the other day?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, don't you think I went back to the Chanel store in Palm Beach because I still wanted that handbag, even though I'm angry with them about Paris?" She said, "Well, didn't I walk in the door and somebody said, 'Would you like a glass of champagne or a glass of water, sparkling or still?' They walked me directly over to the counter. They showed me the handbag. They fawned all over me. And I walked out with the handbag." And she said, "It couldn't have been a more different experience in terms of the service
Yeah.
in the United States versus the Paris store."
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, I love that story because it just shows it's an example of how when you experience these sort of like little, indignities in life, you don't have to tolerate them. For the cost of, a very expensive handbag, you don't have to be made to stand in a queue.
I mean, that's what parents do. They leave you with these lessons
Yeah.
and you never forget those incidents. I'm sure it's going to happen to you one day and you'll do the
Oh
same
yeah.
thing and say, okay, well, stuff it.
Yeah, F you. I'm not I'm not going to stand in your queue.
Oh my,
What's your favorite story about your mother
oh
that's kind of
God.
funny?
Oh.
You have a few.
I have a lot. My mum had a lot of things happen to her, but she was always very upbeat. This book that I've got coming out in October, I really started going back a bit in time and looking at this stuff. And I was quite shocked at some of the things that there's not many people left that I can talk to, but how she managed to always be the life and soul of a party. She was very beautiful. She can make me cry now, but she looked like a young Elizabeth Taylor. And she was everybody's friend, including my school friends. So I would be very pissed off when I would come home and my friends would be sitting around the kitchen table.
A little jealous?
Yeah, telling my mother things that I didn't ever tell my mother anything. My relationship with her was very, I can't even say it was rocky because we didn't fight or anything like that. But if you said, one word that described my mother, I would say busy because she had a
Mm,
lot of children. She was widowed very, very young. So my
mm.
father died at 39, leaving her with 4 children. And the
Good Lord.
youngest was my brother, who was 6 months old. And then these 3 girls. And how she did it, I really don't know. And then she died young. So she was a real health freak in a very strange way for us because in the 60s everybody was getting American food, white sliced
Mhm.
bread. And when we first got our television, you'd see some American shows and they had a garage and they had a washing machine, all things that she didn't have. So it was the thing that a housewife in 50s, 60s, and even 70s Britain, we were all going, oh, they all wanted this stuff.
Sure.
So she was very, very healthy with us, meaning that she baked all her own bread, which was repulsive. I mean, it was like doorstop. And everybody at school used to have these lovely white slice Wonder Loaf, no nutrient type of
Mm,
bread with a bit of jam in the middle. And we would have, stacked grilled vegetable. That was unheard of in those days, especially in the north of England.
yeah.
And we would have, all this healthy stuff. And she would every evening, we would have, a baked potato and a this and a that, and no shop bought food, never went to a restaurant ever. And there was no such thing as takeaway food. But because it's a long, long story. Basically, she had a still baby before me
Mm,
and was sent through my grandmother, who was wealthy, to a specialist called Steptoe. And Steptoe, they're making a movie about him now, with, might be Bradley, anyway, one of the big stars. He was the first person who did the first test tube baby, which was
Oh,
Louise Brown, and changed fertility forever. And he was world famous. Anyway, he buggered up with my mum something and messed things up. So I was sent to this guy who was a vegan in Berkshire, in the south of England. And my mother lived there for 2 years to get her health because she was told she couldn't have any children anymore.
it sounds like a limerick. Once there was a vegan in Berkshire.
Exactly. But he got her healthy and she went and had 4 more children. But she never forgot. She wasn't vegan, but I ate more lentils than anybody's, has ever had when I was
You
a child.
do, yeah.
Yeah, but she didn't look after herself. So she died very, very young. But I thought, if you're up for it, and I'm not supposed to do this, I'll probably get in trouble because what they call a cover reveal. So today, when you launch a book, about 3 months before, they reveal the cover, and everybody does this.
Yeah.
And this is for pre-sales. So it gives your publicists and the salespeople at, like, my publishers, Penguin, Random House, is it going to be a doozy, or is it going to be popular? And then that's how much they're going to push you when the book actually comes out in the fall. So you're not really supposed to do anything before, but I know in June, so it's not too bad, they're going to do a cover reveal, which is beautiful, of this book. But this is a little bit at the introduction of the book, because my book is about stories, when I talk about why I do what I do. So would you like, it's only a little bit, shall I read it to you?
Yes, please.
All right, putting my glasses on.
We're just going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
I'm Sarah Burke, and I host the Women in Media podcast, where I'm exploring the challenges women face in the media spotlight and celebrating our triumphs. My guests come from radio, TV, news, and sports, and we'll cover topics like leadership, diversity, stereotypes, and more. Most of all, I'm looking to build a community through a space where we can discuss anything. The Women in Media podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or at womeninmedia.ca. Are you sitting comfortably, Tommy?
Yes, I am.
I learned the art of embellishing a yarn with humour while sprawled at my mother's feet. My mum was young, beautiful, and exhausted, but she came alive when she told an entertaining tale. Her eyes shone with mischief, and the stern lines of the mouth that kept us kids in line were softened as she spoke. Her storytelling an escape from the mundane chores of family life and the hand that dealt her widowhood in her mid-30s. It wasn't hard to notice that she usually slanted her tales away from the truth for the sole purpose of making us laugh. Our joy was her prescription to carry on. As a storyteller, she was good, but she had nothing on my grandmother. But anyway.
Debbie, you could actually be describing yourself.
Oh, stop. Yeah.
I am serious. If I were writing about you telling a story, I might almost write something quite similar.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to me.
Oh, well, thank you. But
there's a lot of her in you.
Oh, definitely a lot. But that really was her pulse, was making us laugh, because how she did it. We had a fairly big house for then. Most people in my area lived in a row house, a one up, what they call a one up, one down, with a toilet at the back. So we had a detached house that my mother and father had built themselves. And my mum was the brick carrier because she was a lot bigger than my dad. She was very strong. And she always had these friends, and she was always telling stories. So, we'd sit there as kids and, you'd hear the roar of these women. They sit 4:00 in the afternoon, they'd have a scotch and they'd be playing cards and they'd be laughing and talking and stuff. And, that's kind of what I remember, because that was her solace. That was her remedy for the unhappiness. And to be widowed when you are a beautiful woman. But she made all these friends. And I think I've told you this before. What was so awful was during the week, she was kept busy with the neighbors, the other mothers, they were all housewives, But at the weekend, all the doors shut because she was a threat. And I see that today. A lot of my friends who are on their own, the couples take over. And I always, if I have a party, I always have singles there. But I know that was very hard for her because the weekends were terribly long. You're stuck at home with 4 small children, and nobody invited her because they didn't want her around the men. And, so I think that was dreadfully difficult for her. And then you talk about funny stories. So I moved to London very young because she remarried and I just wanted to get out of there. She did stay in touch, but not like we do today. I mean, my kids.
It was a lot more difficult then to stay in touch. Like even when I lived in London in the 1990s, early 90s, to use the telephone was so expensive. Like you would literally be paying like £1.50 for a 3-minute phone call. And at that time, that's like
Yeah,
$10.
tell me what you want. Are you okay? Fine, bye. And that was it. That was you. So
Yes,
you didn't
yes.
stand
The
around.
phone was so expensive in England.
Crazy. If you had a phone.
If you even had a phone, yeah.
Yeah, we used to actually, when we were teenagers and I was living at home, we had a party line with this old bitch across the road. And she would like make rude noise. So, you've waited all evening for this boy to call you. So you're sitting, and we had one phone, so you would unplug it and take it into the next room. So I would go and hide in my mum's bedroom because there was a plug there, away from everybody else, waiting for this boy to call. And then the old bitch across the road would be tapping the phone and farting down the line and doing all these things to get me off the line. And I was going, Mum, tell her to stop. I've waited for Dave to call me all night, So it was funny. But anyway, so I moved to London and, I think all those years, she probably only visited me once or twice. And she came down once, and there were two things that happened. So next to me, I'm sure, God, we're like an old married couple, you and me. I'm sure I've told you this story. But next to in the flat next door were two guys, and they worked for Alitalia, which was the now gone bankrupt Italian airline. And they were very, very gay. They make you look like a kindergarten teacher. But anyway, they were very flamboyant and they were going to all these clubs and it was the days of heaven and all these crazy, wild clubs that we all used to go to because they were really fun.
Yeah. I spent a little time in heaven.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. Yeah, I think I saw you there. Were you standing on a box with a thong?
I was in crushed velvet hot pants and platform boots.
That's it. Because that's what they used to do. Anyway, so, and they would dress up and very often there were coaches would take us all to the clubs. Anyway, so my mum comes down and we're sitting in the living room and, it's quite British, hug, a little bit away from each other. And there's a knock on the door and the two boys came in. Boys, they were in their 40s. And, I'm like 18. And they said, oh, we want to show you what we're wearing tonight. So they come in and they're facing my mother. And my mother said, oh, hello. And I introduced them. And they had on, do you remember chaps?
Of course, yes.
So they had on these shiny leather tight trousers, sequin tops, and the cap, and the caps, the hardline leather caps. And then my mum said, oh, she's charming. She was very chatty with them. And they went, bye then, Trinidad, we're off. They turn around and both the bottoms of their leather trousers, their pants were cut out in a heart shape with see-through plastic on the back. And I just don't think my mother quite understood,
Oh my God. That reminds me of such a good story, very similar story. So my friend Glenn, whose mother Anne and father Wally would come from Kirkcaldy, Scotland to visit him every year. He was born in Scotland and raised there until he was 12. And then he came to Canada with them. But then they went back and he stayed.
Okay.
So he's been a best friend of mine for years and years and years. And his mother, Anne, is a very witty woman. And we took her out to a nightclub in Toronto once while she was here in town. She was curious about it. She wanted to go. And so we took her along. And while we were in the nightclub, this towering drag queen who is a friend of mine came up and was chatting with us. And she was introduced to the drag queen and they were having a little chit chat. And then the drag queen walked away. And I said, well, Anne, I bet you don't have women like that back in Kirkcaldy. And she looked at me and she said, aye, hen, we do. We call them whores.
Oh my God, that's a good Scottish accent. Oh my God. So yeah, I mean, and it kind of, I'm sure my mum at the Mothers Institute would tell that story, and it's so strange. They had no pants. There was a big hole at the back. Anyway, but then I remember taking a sushi had Japanese restaurants were just beginning to open up in London. And of course, we thought it was amazing and fantastic and stuff. So I took her for sushi, and she was a very no nonsense type of person, and she kept looking at it, and then,
Mm.
but I don't understand. It's not cooked. No, mum, it's not. It's a slither of fish, but not cooked. And I said, no. I said, you wrap it up and you put a bit of rice and you, but it's not cooked. Where's the batter?
I mean, it's a valid
it's a
question.
valid question because she had never seen or whatever. But then, and then the other thing that she did was, it was a very tough time when my dad died because we had to keep the house, and the house was paid for. All our stuff was hidden at a neighbour's so that the bailiffs wouldn't take anything. Anyway, she took in lodgers, and we had a factory nearby, a Philips factory, who made light bulbs, so a Dutch company, and so a lot of young men would come up. Where I lived is today it's about 3 hours. Then it was about 6 hours from London. So they would come up and they would be lodgers somewhere during the week, Monday to Friday, and then they would go back to their families in London during the week. So they were kind of, I guess in their 30s, they were middle management, that kind of stuff, white collar workers.
Yeah.
And we managed to cram in sometimes 3 men into our house. So all the kids would be in one room. And we had 2 bathrooms, which was kind of unheard of around there. So these men had one bathroom and my mum and us had the other bathroom. And, kids are amazing because they roll over, don't they? I mean, you take, as a child, you take what's given. So yeah, you've lost.
Very adaptable.
You're very adaptable. And I know, when people are falling apart because they've lost their partners or things but kids really do roll with the punches. So, we went from, a family to suddenly strange men in the house. And as I said, my mum was obviously very unhappy, but very practical. And these men were London men, they're a bit more sophisticated than in the north. So one day I come home from school and there was a fence with her neighbour, Mary, and her and Mary always chatting, chat over the fence. And there was our washing line was there. And my mum, I walk around the garden in my school uniform, and I'm probably 13 years old. And my mother is on her knees, and I think she's sobbing, and I was kind of a bit used to her falling apart, but not during the day. Anyway, so I'm thinking, oh my God. So I run towards her and she's tears running down her face. And I look up and Mary is hanging over the fence, howling and screaming and laughing. They are hysterical and they can't breathe. And of course, you don't find this stuff funny when you're a kid. And I'm like, what is it? What's happened? And all they did was they were pointing at the basket with the washing in, and there was a leather thong in there, right? So
Scandal.
And I think there might have been a satin red one. I come from a place where Y fronts came up to your chest, men's. Yeah. And they'd never, ever seen anything as racy as this.
That's amazing.
And I remember feeling so happy and joyful that something had made her laugh, to that extent. When you're
there's
so
nothing
alone.
like hearing your mother laugh.
Nothing.
There's nothing in the world like it, actually.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And
it's the most beautiful thing.
Yeah. And so there are all those kind of memories. And it was only when I had a family, because I was not easy, I know it's hard to imagine.
I was going to ask, do you think that you were an easy child to raise? Because I know that I wasn't.
No, I was very, I was the eldest. So I was off, even as a younger, probably by 5.
You were the first to break the rules. That's the hard thing about being the eldest.
I took the bus to school from probably 4.5 years old. I took the bus home. I had rules. I had to wait at the bus stop and she would come and get me. I wasn't allowed to cross the road, all this kind. And then on Saturday morning, like so many of our generation, the back door was locked and it was like, you go and play. You don't, we had no television, we had no radio. Well, we had radio, but we had no games. We had no, and you went and played, rain or shine. I was very, very independent. I really did at 16. She said, when you've left school, you can go. I was like, okay, I'll get my suitcase now. And I was gone. And I moved to London alone. So, and there was no question. There was never discussion about going to university ever. And I did okay at school. There was never a discussion of, where will you live in London? I think
Mm,
she made me a ham sandwich and gave me like £5 for the bus, and that was it. And
mm.
ring me when you get there. And like where I can't even remember where I went. And so, but she was busy, and that's what I said. She was knee deep in surviving, putting food on the table, getting the other kids off the ground. There was always other stuff going on, but
I think it's important to remember though, because I've heard you tell that story before about like getting the ham sandwich and the £5 for the bus. And I used to think when you first told me that story, I thought to myself, oh, that's so harsh. But then now, when I hear you say that, I think to myself, what a compliment, that she had the confidence in
oh
you.
yeah,
That you have to remember, this is the person who knows you best
yeah,
in the world.
yeah.
And so for her to have the confidence in you that with a ham sandwich and £5, you could go off to London is a massive compliment,
Oh
actually.
yeah, I think she was I mean, she was never
She knew you'd be
disparaging,
okay.
but she knew I was capable. That was, I think, the big word.
Yes. And she was
And
right.
she was right. And I mean, God knows how I did it. I really don't know. I mean, that's what we were like in those days. But um, it was only really when I had my own children, and she died 2 months before my eldest child, my first child, was born. So that was
Oh,
a tragedy for me, because that was a
really
real
hard.
turning point. And she never told us that she was ill, and she was very. I mean, she had cancer, and it was. She used to say, "Well, she said, well, I've got that kind of little cancer thing. Be fine, be fine." Like she got a ingrowing toenail or something. So we were so busy and cocky with our own lives that we were like, okay, and didn't really ask questions. And then that was it, and it was a
Yeah,
real shock. And then, of course, you're struggling as a new mother, and suddenly it all starts to make sense, why she would
sure.
scream like, get up the stairs, and I used to think, God, she's a wicked witch, as we would duck, as she bashed you over the head. And then, of course, you're doing the same thing, so I think for all mothers, that's the kind of thing. It's the understanding when you're so tired and so drained and so scared and so stressed. And today, I'm hoping that, young people have more help when they have families, because they can talk about stuff. But in those days, even my day, you really had nobody to turn to, that you were,
Mm,
I mean, I've said this before, about you want to throw a child through a window. And I've never had anybody say, oh my God, you should be locked up, because they've all had the same feeling. Maybe they didn't say it out loud, but
sure.
now there are
Just
places,
don't act on it.
yeah, you don't act on it, but
No.
boy, does it come close. And it's a desperate thing. And that's the wonders of motherhood, that you kind of get through it, but you only
Hmm.
really, really appreciate your own mother. And
Yeah.
for me, what is so terribly sad, it was too late, to say, God, how did you do it? So I've talked to
Yeah.
myself, and I've written about it and stuff like that, because I couldn't say a word. I mean, she'd gone, and I mean, even today when things happen, or the kids are rude to me, or I mean, I was so rude to her, so rude to her. I mean, I remember at Christmas saying, I remember getting a toothbrush in my stocking and having a
Yeah.
meltdown, going, seriously? Seriously? That's the best you can do? At like 19 years old. And I mean, God, how ugly was I? I mean, it's just awful. And I know so
Yeah.
many people have that opportunity, and that's what Mother's Day should all be about, is call your mother and say, Mum, I am so sorry for this, this, and this. Because when they're gone, and you can't say you're sorry, and now you understand. She had no money for
I
anything but
mean,
a toothbrush.
you,
Um,
yeah, it's, I think, in my view, again, it's just a perspective because I can't be a mother. To observe the women that I know who are mothers, my own and my sisters who are, and friends of mine who are exemplary moms, it is the riskiest thing that you can do. It's so risky. And I find that like to me, the most attractive quality in a human being is courage. And I think that to be a mother takes so much courage because you have so much to lose once you bring a child into the world. There's nothing more painful than losing a child. There's nothing more scary than the prospect of that. And yet you're sending this person out into the world, which is so chaotic and so dangerous. And all you can do is hope that you've set them up for success in doing that.
Mm.
And, you have to remember, Debbie, that your own mother knew that when she left this earth, she had sent you out into the world with all of the skills that you need, not only to survive, but to be wildly successful, not only just as a woman, but as a mother.
Mm.
And so, she knew, even though she didn't know your kids, that you were ready and that you were set up for success in that way. Because again, like I said earlier, nobody knows you better than your mother.
Yeah, I mean, she used to always just say, "Oh, you'll be fine," and
Yeah, but she's right. She was right about it.
yeah.
You have been fine,
Oh,
more
I'm
than fine.
Yeah. Anyway, God, you could talk about this subject forever. So ring your
I
mum,
know.
and I think anybody who's not speaking to their mum, put your things aside, because I tell you, it's just not worth it. I will never be estranged from my children. I'll sit on the bloody doorsteps, because you just want to make them happy, and you don't want to embarrass
Sure.
them in front of their spouses.
Yeah, and there are plenty of people out there in the world, and I've met many of them, who did not have good mothers. And you find motherhood in other people, in friends, in mentors, in, sometimes in really great bosses and people who teach you. Women, you can find women who will teach you and who will be part of that kind of mothering, feeling for you in your life.
I think anybody who didn't have a good mother, or somebody who's sitting here listening to this and say, well, I'm not calling my mum, she was so awful to me. Again, going back to generations, because the generation before that were coming out of the Victorian era, coming out of wars, they were very different. And when the way my mother was brought up, my mother went to I've told you this before, my mother went to boarding school at 5 and came back 2 or 3 times a year, on a bicycle about 50 miles.
Unimaginable now.
And that was a large chunk of Brits who went to boarding school, because really that was the way it was done. And, and then you had summers at home, if you were lucky, but that affected the next generation. And then they tried harder, and then so sometimes you have to say, well, my mum did terrible things, but what was her story? And
sure. And forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself, not to somebody else.
Oh, that's nice.
And those of us who understand that, really deeply understand that. So to everybody out there who is celebrating a wonderful mother, we are doing the same thing, whether she's here or not here on this earthly plane. But to everyone out there who also struggles with having a mother who was not so great, or who finds motherhood in relationships with other people who are not their biological moms, we celebrate with you too. So happy Mother's Day, everyone.
Happy Mother's Day.
Especially to you, Debbie.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please rate us, send in a review, and make sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is distributed by the Women in Media Podcast Network. Find out more at womeninmedia.network.